I mentioned about bordering, and in Australia, like most civilized countries, they have women in the top four, and so bordering involves installed makes the point that the logic of Aristotle doesn't work for promises, and that's also been made in the House of Lords and the Cobb case. So in the Cobb case, Lord Scott makes the same point. It says that an estoppel bars the object of it from asserting some fact or fact, or sometimes something that's a mixture of fact or law, that stands in the way of some right, claimed by the person entitled to the benefit. So what he's saying is that an estoppel bars A from asserting a fact or fact, or a matter of law. So again, it just can't really work for a promise. It doesn't work for a promise. Okay? But we have a section on the handout called promissory estoppel, and a section in the textbook called promissory estoppel. Now this is oxymoronic, it doesn't make sense. Promissory estoppel. Yeah, it's an oxymoron, and Denning was the first. Well, yeah. So how to make a joke like that. You can make up a joke about what you can make up your own joke about which part of oxymoron is provided by Denning. But the reason we have promissory estoppel is basically because of a series of cases where Denning is using estoppel principles to give effect to promises. Now, promissory estoppel hasn't really been discussed properly by either the House of Lords or the Supreme Court. It did get to the House of Lords in this Woodhouse case, but they didn't really have to get into it. And Lord Helsham said the whole sequence of the case is based on promissory estoppel principles, raise problems of coherent exposition which have never been systematically explored, which means, quite what they're saying, to do a mess. Okay? Now, the best way to understand promissory estoppel, I think, is to look at the specific cases and the specific principles it's based on. The reason promissory estoppel is a mess is because, I think, it's based on three different principles. The only way to understand it is to separate out the different principles. And actually, I think the three principles are perfectly sensible. They're quite good principles, but they have nothing to do with estoppel. Okay? So they are good principles, but they're not about estoppel. Okay? So the first one is a case that Denning got a lot of store on, it's a case called Hughes and Metropolitan Railway Code. Okay? And example 4 is basically Hughes and Metropolitan Railway Code. So A is B's landlord, and the terms of the lease says B has 6 months to do these repairs, otherwise they can get kicked out. But A and B then start negotiating about B surrendering the lease, effectively selling it back to A. Now, as they're negotiating, A agrees to be deferring those repairs. But then, when the 6 months are up, A then turns around and says, I can kick you out now, because you've had this 6 months and you haven't done the repairs. Okay? Now, the agreement to defer the repairs wasn't contractually binding on the facts of that case. So the difficulty that B has is the contract says, you've got 6 months to do the repairs, otherwise I can kick you out. The 6 months have gone, the repairs haven't been done, and the contract was never modified or varied. So A says, now I can kick you out. Now, is that fair? Well, obviously not. So the court can stop it happening. And Lord Cairns, Lord Chancellor, said, it's the first principle on which all courts of equity proceed. Okay? That if parties have entered into definite and distinct terms involving certain legal results, etc., the strict rights arising under the contract will not be enforced or will be kept in suspense. The person who otherwise might enforce those rights will not be allowed to enforce them, where it be inequitable having regard to the dealings between the parties. Now, Lord Denning refers to that quotation from Cairns a lot, but in itself it's not very helpful. All that is saying is that if it's inequitable for you to do this, we'll stop you doing it. But it doesn't really help us explain why it's inequitable for A to do this. Okay? Lord Blackburn, similarly, he says, even if A himself didn't intend to abandon the notice, if he led B to believe that would happen, then there's a ground for giving belief in equity. So the idea is that if A is leading B to believe that if B acts in a particular way, A won't acquire a right, or A won't enforce a right, and the court can stop A from enforcing that right. But normally, if B acts in a particular way, A would get the right. So if B doesn't do the repairs, A gets the right to terminate the lease. That's the normal pattern. But if the reason why B acts in that way is because A has led B to believe that A won't get that right, it would then be unfair for A to insist on that right. It's unfair for you to assert a right if the only reason you have it is because of my action. And the only reason I act in that way is because you led me to believe I wouldn't get the right. That just seems, on any view, unfair. Okay? Now, I think the reason it's unfair is because it'd be unjust for you to get that benefit. You shouldn't be able to get the benefit of kicking me out, terminating the lease. If the reason I acted in that way is because you led me to believe you wouldn't get that benefit. That just obviously seems to be unfair. Now, in the Hughes case, the judge has talked about equity, but the principle is so obvious, you want to get it as common law. The Hickman and Haynes was a common law case about the sale of goods. The contract says B has to deliver by the end of June. Then A says that A can deliver after that. So B fails to deliver. That doesn't mean that A can then turn around and say, actually, I'm rejecting the goods. Okay? At common law, this adoption of waiver or forbearance means A can't immediately terminate the contract. But if B keeps on failing to deliver, if B doesn't deliver in a reasonable time, then A can terminate. So this principle, it doesn't necessarily mean that A loses their right. What it means is the right has to be suspended sometimes for a reasonable period to allow B to adjust their behaviour. Okay? It doesn't necessarily have the effect of extinguishing the right. What it can do instead is suspend it, which depends on the case. So in the Hughes Metropolitan case, it's still true that B has to do these repairs within 6 months, but the 6-month period doesn't include the time when they were negotiating for the surrender of the lease. Okay? So the obligation to do repairs in 6 months remains, it's just the interpretation of 6 months has to change. And in Hickman and Hayes, B still has to deliver the goods, because they don't have to do it by the 30th of June. Okay? So the principle in the Hughes case seems to me to be perfectly clear. If you lead someone to believe that if they act in a particular way, you won't get the right, you can't then claim that right when they act in that way. But I don't think that's got anything to do with estoppel. It's not about being prevented from denying the truth of something. I think it's more about stopping A getting an unjust benefit. And it's a principle about how rights work. Normally B's action would give A a right, but because of what A did, you say on these facts it doesn't give A a right. So I think that's a perfectly sensible principle, but I don't feel it's to do with estoppel. Is there any sort of threat to doctrine of consideration? But what it does mean is that if A promises to do something, the promise can have an effect even though it's not part of the contract. So in Hughes and Hickman, the promise isn't part of the contract, but it does have some effect. But that's fine, because the promise isn't contractually binding. It's not binding because of the contract. The promise has an effect because it makes it unjust for A, to get the benefit that A would get by asserting the right arising from B's conduct. But only explaining the consideration is not saying that A promise is contractually binding. This principle is about stopping A from taking an unjust benefit. Okay? That's the huge principle, I think. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Maybe like in the first step here, like the estoppel stops you from saying something which is stops you from denying the truth.
Yeah.
And so maybe here then estoppel stops A from getting the benefit.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You could say that there is a sort of estoppel here, because what you're doing is you're stopping A from taking a benefit. So you might sort of phrase it as estoppel in that sense. The difficulty with it is, to the extent that it's about anything A says, it's to do what A said in the future. So it's about A saying, I won't enforce this right, I won't require this right in the future. The difficulty with applying an estoppel analysis is to do the fact that it relates to something in the future. I mean, you're right, you could try and put it in terms of stopping something happening. But it is important that in the Hughes case, for example, which is where this principle comes from, none of the judges mentioned estoppel. None of the judges talked about estoppel in the Hughes case. Okay? So you're right, you can try and cast it in terms of estoppel, I can see that, it's about stopping A from taking this benefit. But it's certainly, you know, you've still got the problem. If you're looking at the conduct of A on which it's based, that conduct is to do with what's going to happen in the future, because you go back to that logical problem. So you're right, I can see the idea that you're trying to put it in a estoppel.
Yeah. So it would be wise for us to rely on that during example.
Well, I don't think I'm marking any exams. So the point is, the Hughes case, I'm making 2 points about the Hughes case. Number one, the judges in it don't mention estoppel at all.
Yeah.
Number two, the principle can be explained quite simply without referring to estoppel. Okay, those are my 2 points. Now, it is true that Lord Denning started to come up with some ideas, but later on got packaged up as permissive estoppel, and one of those ideas is based on Hughes. So it is now orthodox to refer to the Hughes principle as being about permissive estoppel. So you're never going to get in any trouble for referring to the Hughes principle as permissive estoppel, because that's what McFalene does. Okay? So you're never going to get, no one's going to go, oh dear, they're calling that permissive estoppel. That's fine, everyone calls it permissive estoppel. So what I'm trying to do is to be interesting by saying that it's not permissive estoppel. And also to be right by pointing out that none of the judges called it estoppel. And even Lord Denning said it wasn't estoppel. If we move on to the next case, the High Street case, which is a very important one. High Street is worth reading. You know, it's quite short. It seems that Denning just gave it orally at the end of the case, but at a hearing during the day, at the end of the day, Denning just said, here you go, here's the answer. He didn't even write it out, it's quite easy to read. Try to have this point about it. High Street is where he says, oh, if Denning had time to think about it before, it was just during the lunch break. But that's a bit harsh, because Denning obviously had to think about this stuff for a while before that. So High Street, the facts are there. ABC's landlord, it's a big commercial thing, so it leads to a block of flats. The idea is that C will then rent them out to tenants. And the rent's $2,500 a year. But there's a war, B has trouble renting out the flats. So A agrees to reduce B's rent to basically 50%. So B pays that rent and A accepts it until the end of the first half of 1945. By that point, all the flats are let. You know, the war is pretty much over. And so then A says to B, I want the full rent for the second half of 1945 onwards. And this was sort of weird litigation. A and B were, A was the parent company, B was the subsidiary, so it's basically sort of friendly litigation. I want to work out what the position is. So A isn't asking for full rent for the period between 1940 and 1945. A isn't asking for that. Okay. All A is asking for is the full rent for the second half of 1945 onwards, by which point there's no need for reduction in price because it's easy enough to rent out the flat. So the case is actually just about full rent going forward, and Denny says, yes, that's fine, you can claim the full rent. But the reason the case is important is because Denny also talks about what would have happened if A had claimed the full rent between 1940 and 1945, which A wasn't doing, but the judge talked about what would have happened if that claim had been made. Okay? Now, the difficulty there is, imagine A had claimed the full rent. The problem is, there's no consideration for the promise to accept the lower rent. It's like Penal say, Folks and Beer, in me select move, there's no consideration for the promise to accept the lower rent. So how would that promise be binding? Well, Denning says, the law has not been standing still since Jordan and Money. Well, it's true that Jordan and Money is a House and Lords decision, and there haven't been any House and Lords decisions. There's been a series of cases which, although they're essentially cases of estoppel, they're not really such. Okay? He's saying this isn't actually about estoppel. There are cases in which a promise was made which was intended to create legal relations and was going to be acted on, and it was acted on. In such cases, the court has said that the promise must be honoured. This is exactly what he later said in the modern law review article. He thinks that if a promise is intended to be acted on, and it is acted on, it should be binding. And he's saying that isn't to do with estoppel, it's just about when promises are binding. Okay? So it says, in each case, the court held the promise to be binding, even though under the old common law, I don't know what I mean by old there, even under the old common law, it might be difficult to find any consideration for it. Now he says something interesting. He says, this principle, you can't use it to sue someone, you can't generate a cause of action on it, but you can stop someone acting inconsistently with it. In that sense, and that sense only, that they give rise to an estoppel. Then if you promise to accept the lower end, and they do then pay the lower end, and you accept it, that promise is binding, even though there's no consideration. And he says it isn't about estoppel, it comes from cases like the Metropolitan Railway. Okay? And he said it's not about estoppel. Okay? But it says the logical consequence is that a promise to accept a smaller sum and discharge of a larger sum, if acted upon, is binding notwithstanding the absence of consideration. Okay? But again, that can't be right, because that's just inconsistent with Penal's case, Folks and Beer, and later on Select Move. So it's surprising he's saying that. Remember, this is just a first instance decision. This is just a High Court decision. Jordan and Money, Folks and Beer, a House of Lords. Okay? And it's all over here, because not actually claiming that back rent anyway. Now, so what is the principle here that Sterling was talking about? Well, he developed it a bit in another case, D&T Builds and Reeds. And again, it doesn't talk about estoppel. Not in this bit anyway. It says, where there's been a true accord under which the creditor voluntarily agrees to accept a lesser sum in satisfaction, like I'll take a lower rent, and the debtor acts by paying the lesser sum, and the creditor accepts it, then it is inequitable the creditor afterwards to insist on the balance. Okay? The idea is, it's not just the promise to accept lesser money, it's the fact that lesser money was paid and was accepted. Okay? That seems to be the important idea. Now, again, I think there is some justification for this principle. But, again, it seems that the principle isn't about estoppel. The idea here is, if I'm under a duty to you, it's possible for you to accept substitute performance. Okay, so I might have to do like the university, I might have to do like 4 contract lectures and 5 property 1 lectures. And I might say to them, is it okay if I do 9 property 1 lectures? Because I find contract lectures really boring, so I'm not going to do that. And the university says, yeah, okay, you can do 9 property 1 lectures, and I do them instead. Can they then turn around and say, oh, you breached your contract because you didn't do the mix of contract and property law lectures that we asked for. Well, again, that would seem unfair. The point is, I was under a duty, but I offered a substitute, and they accepted the substitute. That's the important point, it's the acceptance of the substitute performance. I think it's reasonable to say that if someone says in the duty, though, accept substitute performance, then the duty is discharged. That's the crucial point. The reason they can't sue me is not because they made a promise not to sue me, it's because my duty, the thing they're trying to sue me for, has been discharged. So I think this is a rule about when duties are discharged. It's not really a rule about when promises are binding. It's a rule about when duties are discharged. So the important point here is not that they promised to accept lesser money, it's they did actually accept lesser money. I think that's an important thing in this case. Okay. So I think in general, it's reasonable to say that if A accepts substitute performance of a duty, that duty is then discharged. And the reason A can't sue D is not to do with estoppel or anything, to do with the duty no longer existing. The only question is whether that analysis can apply where the duty consists of a duty to pay money. Because if you look at Folks and Deere, it looks like they did make a payment in that case. The payment was accepted, but the House of Lords still said you could go back on it. So it seems that general principle about acceptance of substitute performance of a duty, I think is a good one, but it doesn't apply if the duty is a duty to pay money. Okay? But it seems to me that all Organic is doing in High Street is restating that principle. And you can see this more clearly in another case, setting case, WJR and Co. And what he calls it here is waiver. He calls it principle of waiver. Okay? If one party by the conduct leaves another to believe that its strict rights will not be insisted upon, then you're not afterwards allowed to insist on the strict legal right. A buyer may leave the third to believe he's not insisting on the contractual time for delivery. A seller may accept a lesser sum for the goods. Okay? And he says, I think this is right, it doesn't depend on detriment. Because there's no detriment to paying less rent than you meant to pay. There's no detriment to being able to provide goods later than you said you'd provide them. There's no detriment to me in doing the lectures that I want to do rather than the lectures that someone else wants me to do. It's not about detriment. It's about the acceptance of the substitute performance by A. I think that's the important thing. Okay. So why is any talking about estoppel or waiver at all? I think it's just to try and get around Folks and Deere. Because Folks and Deere says this principle doesn't apply where the duty is to pay money. So Denning says, in effect, oh well, they've forgotten about all this equitable stuff, like in Hughes and Metropolitan Railway. But that would be slightly surprising, because three of the judges in Folks and Deere were also in Hughes and Metropolitan Railway. So to say that the judges in Folks and Deere had forgotten about Hughes seems very unlikely. Three of the judges were in that very case, and only took place like a couple of years earlier. So what David's saying is, you want to get round the Folks and Deere problem. To get round it, he takes a perfectly standard principle about acceptance and substitute performance and dresses it up in his pocket. Okay. And the other judges go, oh yes, that sounds great. Now again, this isn't just an equitable thing, you see it as a common law. So I'll give you an example of a case there, it's a shipping case. And shipping cases are often named after the ship involved. And, you know, you can see why when you look at the full name of the case. So, the ship owner, they had a duty to provide a ship that was suitable for loading grain on. And they didn't do that, so at that point A could have rejected the ship. But A didn't reject it, they used it anyway. Then later on A complained about it, and the court said, well, you can't complain about it. B offered you this ship which didn't comply with their duty, and you accepted it. That means that B's duty is now discharged. You can't sue D. Now that's called sometimes waiver or total waiver, but it seems to me it's about acceptance of substitute performance, which seems perfectly reasonable. Okay? Now notice, actually, this the Hughes principle, which Lord Denning says applies in these cases. Denning is using the Hughes principle here. If you think about it, the Hughes principle can't possibly apply. Because the Hughes principle is about cases where A tries to assert a right that they acquired as a result of B's action, when B only acted in that way because A led them to believe that A wouldn't get that right. That's what the Hughes principle is about. But in high trees, the right that A is asserting is just the right to be paid the rent. And A had that right all along. A's right to the rent arose before any promise was made to B. So the Hughes principle obviously can't apply in a case like high trees. The Hughes principle is about preventing A from getting a right as a result of B's action. Whereas the right you want to assert in high trees, if you're suing for the full rent, is a right that A had before they made any promise to reduce the rent. So the Hughes principle can't apply at all in high trees. And high trees is about a separate principle, about acceptance of substitute performance. The only problem is that that principle hasn't been applied in Post and Beer to cases of payments of a lesser sum. And therefore, to get the result that you want to do in high trees, then you have to dress up this principle as some sort of estoppel. I mean, that's what happens in a later case. Okay. And you can sort of see the mess this leads to in Collier. Again, Collier is an important case, it's worth reading, Collier and Wright. In fact, I'm on the screen there. So these one of three former members of a party, and they're jointly liable for a debt. Now, if you're jointly liable for a debt, it means that each of you has to pay the full amount. So the creditor could choose any of you to sue, and you have to pay the full amount. Then it's up to you to try and sue the other partners to make them pay their fair share. But as far as the creditor is concerned, they can come after any of you for the full amount. Okay? So you've got these three former members of a partnership that are all jointly liable for A. So A wants to sue B, but B says, well, I reached an agreement today that in return for me paying a third of the debt, A wouldn't sue me anymore, they'd just go after the other partners. Now it'd be unfair for A to try and get the full debt from me. Okay? The reason that A wants the full debt from B is because the other partners are bankrupt. There's not much good for suing them. So B's already paid a third of it, and B says, well, that was part of an agreement today, it'd be unfair for A now to try and get more money from me. Okay? Now the way I think this should go is as follows. B should say, look, I accepted my substitute performance, I accepted my payment of a third as performance of my duty, and therefore that duty is discharged. A can't come after me. A then says, well yes, there is that principle, but it's inconsistent with Post and Beer. The court should then decide whether the principle should apply even to acceptance of a lesser sum in discharge of a debt. That's what should happen. But instead, it gets talked about in terms of promissory estoppel, which I think is confusing, because it's not to do with estoppel. And it's not even to do with promises, it's to do with acceptance of a lower sum. And in fact, that's basically what Matrix's argument says. If the debtor offers to pay part only, the creditor accepts, in reliance to the debtor pays, then the creditor will, by virtue of the doctrine of promissory estoppel, be bound to accept that sum in full and final satisfaction, in his result of itself being equitable. Now, I agree with that, but I don't see what it's got to do with promissory estoppel. I don't see how the promise is relevant. And I don't see how it's about preventing someone from denying a particular fact. It's about the law saying, if substitute performance is accepted, the duty is discharged. That's what seems to be happening to me in those cases. The only reason we're talking about estoppel is because we're trying to get around Post and Beer. Whereas if you think Post and Beer is wrong on that point, claim. But notice, I'm not suggesting that this means that a promise to pay less should be consideration. What I'm suggesting is that actually paying less and having that accepted as discharge should discharge the debt. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's promise to pay a lower sum should be consideration. I'm just saying that actually doing it and actually having it accepted, that should discharge the duty. And I'm not saying that's about consideration, because consideration is about whether something is contractually binding. And this isn't about whether something is contractually binding, it's just about whether a duty is discharged or not. So this stuff is a little bit tricky. I mean, I have got an article about this, which I put up on Moodle, which you can read if you want to. But, you know, it's a bit tricky, there's no getting away from that. But really, I think you just sort of look at Hughes, look at High Street, try and work out what the principles are. Yeah? As far as I can tell, those principles are fair enough, but they're not really about Aristotle. And yet, we now talk about them as being about Mr. Aristotle, even though the term Mr. Aristotle doesn't make any sense. Okay? Now, there is a third principle which comes up in Mr. Aristotle. And you can see this in the sort of general formulation of Mr. Aristotle. So, Robert Doss went on to be Lord Doss, in speaking he gives this sort of summary of Mr. Aristotle, which is used in quite a lot of the textbooks. And this is probably what you'll see in the appendix and stuff. So, the Mr. Aristotle requires a legal relationship, a representation by aiders and won't enforce his rights, reliance renders it inequitable in all the circumstances for aid and enforce his strict rights, or at least to do so, or be restored to his former position. Okay? Starting to look a bit more like Aristotle, because it's talking about representation and reliance. Okay, so it's starting to look a little bit like Aristotle. So where do we see this? Well, an example actually is where we do a limitation period. The limitation period is very important in practice. Okay, so if somebody carelessly runs you over, you're walking back from the lecture and some taxi carelessly runs you over, how long have you got to sue them? Any idea?
3 years.
Longer than that. Actually, that's a bad example. No, you might be right, actually. It's a bad example of the personal injury thing. But yeah, basically, normally you get 6 years to sue. There's some different person injury. Sorry, that should have changed the example. That's why I'm not recording lectures. So the basic point is, once the limitation period is up, once the time is expired, you can't sue them anymore. So even if they've committed assault or something, if you don't sue them in time, then they're going to be safe, you can't sue them. So what you could have, is you could have a case where the limitation period is coming up, so you want to start suing them, and they say to you, oh, don't worry about suing me now, I won't make an issue about the limitation point. And they say, don't worry, we're not going to make an issue about limitation, don't worry about suing us now. And you think, okay, that's relief. You don't bother getting all your evidence together, you don't sue them. Then the 6 years are up, and they turn around and say, oh, you can't sue me now. Now in that case, you could use the Metropolitan Railway. You could say, look, they're not allowed to use the limitation defence because they told me they wouldn't, and the only reason they have the limitation defence is because I acted in a particular way. I only did that because they told me they wouldn't raise the defence. The Hughes would just sort that out for you. The difficulty is where the limitation period has already expired. The limitation period has already expired, and then they tell you they're not going to raise the limitation defence. So for a contractual claim, it's 6 years. So more than 6 years afterwards, they tell you they're not going to use the limitation defence. And so you start to incur money, instructing lawyers, getting the evidence together. Then they turn around and say, we are going to use the limitation defence. Now, Hughes can't help you, because they had the defence before they made that promise to you. And High Street can't help you, because it's nothing to do with substitute performance. But there are some cases that say, well, they promised they wouldn't enforce their strict legal rights. You've relied on it. You would suffer a detriment if they're allowed to go back on it. Therefore, it'd be inequitable for them to do it, so we can stop them doing it. Okay, the ION is an English case on that, and there are a couple of big Australian cases on it. Okay? The Australian case involves the government, but the Australian case, there was some naval accident years and years ago, and people wanted to sue, and the government said, okay, fair enough, if we were careless, we'll pay you, don't worry about limitations. And then either the government changed, or the government just changed its mind and said, actually, you can't do it because of limitations. And you know, you shouldn't have to do that. Now, those cases, I don't think you can put them under Hughes, I don't think you can put them under ICRU, so there seems to be a separate principle here. And that principle is that if you promise not to enforce a right, and someone relies on that promise, and would suffer a detriment, so that it'd be inequitable for you to go back on it, then the court can prevent you going back on it. Okay, now that principle does seem to be recognised in English law, but the really important point is that you can't use that as a way of suing someone. It can't create a cause of action in English law. So you can use that principle as a defence, but you can't use it to get a cause of action. Okay? The best way to see this is an example. So this example 8 here is based on Walton's Laws, which is an Australian code. So an important one, and it's in McKendrick and everything. So Walton's Laws. B owns some land, A is considering taking a lease, and so they enter into negotiations with B. Okay, A was a big supermarket, and they wanted to build a supermarket on that land. The negotiations progressed. A and B finalised the terms of the lease, they know how they're going to do it, but the contract hasn't yet been signed, and you have to sign for land. So to get the land ready for the start of the lease, B has to do some work on it. So they check with A, they say that it's okay for us to start doing this work, if we don't want to do it in the absence of a contract. And A, in effect, says, oh, don't worry, there will be a contract. B starts the work, incurs expense, A then decides not to go ahead. Now what B wants to do is they want to sue A. They want to say to A, look, you promised us you'd enter into this contract, we relied on it, we will now suffer a detriment if you were allowed to go back on it, we want to sue you. Now in English law you can't do that. Promissory estoppel can't assist B in that case. Okay? Because the promise that A made wasn't a promise not to enforce a right that A has. It was a promise to give B a right. And in English law, promissory estoppel can only help the promises not to enforce a right. Whereas this was a promise to give B a right. So in English law, promissory estoppel can't help. In Australia and in America, it's different. So in Australia, in Walton's Laws, B won. And the requirements for promissory estoppel in Australia are set out there by Justice Brennan, and there are 6 of them. So basically what they mean is if you satisfy those requirements, B can sue A. But that's not true in England. In England, promissory estoppel can't be used to bring a claim. And the case that shows you that is Coombe and Coombe. Okay? And in Coombe and Coombe, what Denny said, Denny again, I mean, there were other judges in England, you know, after the war, it wasn't just them. But much as I'm inclined to favour the principle stated in the High Court case, it's important shouldn't be stretched too far lest it be endangered. The principle doesn't create new causes of action. It only prevents the party from insisting upon his strict legal rights when it gives just to land enforcement. Okay. Seeing that the principle never stands alone as giving a cause of action in itself, it can never do away with the necessity of consideration. The doctrine of consideration is too firmly fit to be overthrown by tidily. Okay? So let's slightly sort of on the side of consideration. Then he says it's still effective in large and mitigated rates, but it still remains a cardinal effective at formation of the contract, so not that it's modification or discharge. Now, it's just making that up to say you don't need consideration for modification. Yeah, that's what Gladbrook, folks from there, all those cases say you do need consideration for modification of the contract. He's just making that up a bit. But what he's saying is this principle about promise, reliance, detriment, you can't use that as a cause of action just as a defence. Now, if you look at the Hughes principle, that is a principle that operates to stop A acquiring a right. So it's true that the Hughes principle is only ever defensive, it only is ever about stopping A acquiring a right. And it's true that the high truth principle is also defensive, because it's only about saying that B's duty is being discharged. So it's true that because of their nature, the Hughes principle and the high truth principle are necessarily defensive. But this third principle about promise, reliance, detriment, there's no logical reason why that should be purely defensive. And in fact, English law allows promise plus reliance plus detriment to give C a cause of action, but only if the promise relates to land. If the promise relates to land, it can be a cause of action, but you can have a claim. I mean, don't worry about consideration. So there's nothing logical, there's nothing inherent in the principle of promise, reliance, detriment to say that it can't be a cause of action. It is in Australia, it is in America, it is in England if the promise relates to land. So this is the dark thing about Walton Stores, example 8. If what had happened in Walton Stores was that A has promised B that A would give B a lease, if A promises B to give B a lease, then there's a thing called proprietary estoppel, which means that the promise, the reliance, and the detriment can give B a claim. So if A instead promises B that A will take a lease, proprietary estoppel can't apply. Because proprietary estoppel only applies if A's promise to B is to give B the right in relation to land. And in example 8, A isn't promising to give B a right in relation to land. Okay? So what you have in English law is you have this principle about a promise, reliance, and detriment or inequity. But it only works if the promise that A makes is either a promise not to enforce a right, or it's a promise to give B a right in relation to land. Okay. Now that doesn't make any sense at all, that is a bit mad. But the reason we've got there is because that principle has been confused with the Hughes principle and the high truth principle. And it's perfectly logical for the Hughes principle and the high truth principle to be just defensive, to be about stopping A from getting a right. But if it's a principle about promise, reliance, detriment, there's no logical reason why it can't give B a claim. It does in other countries, it does where the promise is to give B a right in relation to land. Now Denning's argument in Kuhn is that it would undermine consideration if we allowed it to work. But that's not true, because it only undermines consideration if the duty it's imposing on A is a contractual duty, because consideration is about when A comes under a contractual duty. And when we look at this principle, we can see that the duty that A comes under isn't a contractual duty. Okay? The way you can see that is by looking at how it operates in proprietary estoppel. Because in proprietary estoppel, this principle does give rise to a cause of action. What you need is a representation or assurance, reliance, and detriment, and it does give rise to a cause of action. But we know that it's not the same as a contractual cause of action, because even in the case, I'll just skip ahead a bit, even in a case such as Jennings and Rice, where proprietary estoppel works, where A has made a promise, even when the principle applies, the right that B gets isn't a contractual right. In Jennings and Wright, what B expected to get was the house and the furniture. But B didn't get that. Although proprietary estoppel protected B, and so gave effect to A's promise, it didn't impose a duty on A to perform the promise. There's no duty of A to honour the promise. All that B got was what the court thought was necessary to remove B's detriment. So when this principle operates in the context of proprietary estoppel, it doesn't threaten consideration, I don't think, because it doesn't impose a contractual duty. And the reason we know the duty is not contractual is because A doesn't necessarily have to perform. What the duty does is it ensures that B doesn't suffer a detriment. A needs to do what's necessary to stop B suffering a detriment. And that means A doesn't have to comply with the promise. Whereas if it were a contract, A would have to comply with the promise. So I think we're in this trade-off position where we have this principle about promise, reliance, detriment, but because it's confused with the Hughes principle and the High Street principle, it says not to be a cause of action. The only justification for that is if you're worried about consideration. But if the promise is to give me a right in relation to land, we know that there can be a cause of action. And I don't think that does undermine consideration, because the duty of A is not a contractual duty. And we know that because A doesn't always have to do what they promise. And Jennings and Wright is an example. Okay. So, I had to skip over the proprietary estoppel bit there, so I think I've given you enough guidance on the handout. What I'll do next time then is I'll finish off this bit, look at the proprietary estoppel, go back to consideration, then we'll do potential rate, legal relations, and privacy as well.